Hey, everybody. I'm Esther Weinberg. I am the Chief Leadership Development Officer and founder of the Ready Zone. And on today's show, we're going to talk about change management lies. We'll also talk about facts versus meaning, why toxic positivity is just getting us all down and how to get out of it, and why it's really important to make shit up in order to be resilient. Stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives. Let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Do you consider trust, respect, and safety important in your corporate culture? If you're a leader and you said yes, then are you willing to measure those things to see if they're actually part of your culture? Well, that's where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Find out more about me, you can go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. This episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to the question, how can we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your mind, your heart, and your soul have been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some real and often intense conversations with some of the world's most interesting people. We're talking about quantum physicists, Grammy Award-winning entertainers, entrepreneurs, skeptics, quantum physicists. Some folks you might think, I'd never agree with that person. And you might be totally surprised at how truly fascinating they are. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sink your teeth into a delicious episode of Curiosity Bites. As always, you can find us, both the shows actually, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, or wherever it is you tune into podcasts. We always need your help in staying relevant, so please get over there, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And please share it with everyone you know. If you are a regular listener, big thank you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. We are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. You can listen to us on Google Home and Alexa by simply saying, play Dov Baron podcast. Again, thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. For about 30 plus years, we've been hearing a lot of talk about something called change management. But what does that actually mean? What are the lies about change management that have been very convenient to believe, but have actually done massive damage to trust? If you're a fan of this show, you know that we sincerely believe in putting more emphasis on people and how critical that is for business growth. Most organizations have a strong focus on implementing the mechanics of business. However, the mechanics of business, there's often a tendency to minimize or completely ignore or overlook the people. Sure, we give lip service to the idea that our people are our greatest asset, but that's often little more than rhetoric. So the paradox of all this is, if you're going to continue to innovate, to drive new products and services, and you're going to have those things become the engine of your economics, you've got to develop your people. It's just not an option to not do that. So that being said, it can be challenging to make the direct connection between growing your people and growing your bottom line. But again, if trust, respect, and safety are genuinely important to the corporate culture, are you willing to test and measure those things to actually be part of, see if they're actually part of your culture? And if you can, how can you do that? Well, let's find out together, because that's exactly where we're going. You see, my guest today is Esther Weinberg. Now, she is a business growth accelerator that equips executives in high growth industries to create game-changing breakthroughs, increase profitability, and declining markets, and create successful and sustainable portable virtual cultures. Very important. with executives and leaders and teams. She does all. As a founder and chief leadership development officer of the Ready Zone, she moves leaders through change with proven systems that create big pivots, big impact, and big returns. Esther's philosophy is to reframe, refocus, and realign. And that has been the transforming organizations, cultures, and bottom lines of companies like Netflix, Warner Media, CNN, Disney, NBC Universal, and Sony. Esther is a contributor to Forbes and has been in executive positions at companies like Disney and Fox. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome Esther Weinberg!
I gotta tell you, I think you should be following me around every day. That would just be amazing.
Every time you open the living room and your husband's there, that's what you'll hear. Every time you go over to your family's house, that's what you'll hear. I think they might get a bit sick of it, but it'll be entertaining for you.
It'll make me very happy.
Sure. Okay. So I'm really glad to have you here. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for waiting to get on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Oh, I'm excited about it today.
So where we always like to start the show is in this time of everyone's claiming to be an influencer.
Yeah.
Who is somebody that we might not know or even consider who's been a major influence on your leadership?
Oh, wow.
Like I said, it might not be obvious, or, maybe.
God, it's so funny because I'll tell you this. I did not, a few years ago, my aunt was sitting around, we were sitting at a table at another one of my aunt's house. And she told me a story that I had never known before. And since then, it has entirely reshaped my life and leadership.
Oh, wow.
So it's great and a true story. So when my great grandmother, her name was Dina, and she was born and she lived in northern Palestine, many in the 1800s when it was dust.
Mm-hmm.
And she had 12 children, and many of them died from this plague that happened in Israel. And her husband was very religious. She was very religious. And he would go off and study in caves and then would come back on the Sabbath and spend the Sabbath with my great grandmother.
Wow.
And she decided, because they were very poor, she had to provide for a family. So she became an entrepreneur and started her own business.
Wow.
She started a merchant business and started taking donkeys up to Damascus and selling goods and bringing them back. And then eventually, because in Jewish culture, actually, women cannot divorce men in very religious circles. She actually wound up also, if her entrepreneurial skills wasn't enough, she wound up divorcing her husband at the time, remarrying and keeping her hyphenated last name, which women in my dad's mom's side had done for generations.
Wow.
So once I heard that story, I was like, okay, it pieced so many pieces of the puzzle together, because she was such a woman who believed in human dignity and such a person who believed in her own respect and her own value. And the moment I learned that years ago, it reframed my leadership, my way of being for the rest of my life. It was foundational.
What do you think the lesson is there for other leaders who are tuned into this? Because, that's a pretty cool story of a woman of that age, of that time, doing those seemingly, quote, impossible things. What do you think the lesson is in that for people who are just listening, who are not related, but are going, wow, what's the takeaway?
Yeah, I think, and what I've seen also in leadership is sometimes we wait to lead or wait for the right moment. And I find that in the story about her, what she saw was that this was what she had. I mean, look, I haven't talked to her, so I'm assuming many things, but for her, this is what she knew she had to do. I think for my great grandmother, from what I know about her, there was nothing about like a glass ceiling or I can't do this. It was that, yes, I know I had my place, but that place doesn't work for me anymore. And so what can I do to be a change agent where I am? And so often I see people sometimes thinking that I don't have the right title. It's all how can I have how can I have influence without authority?
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think she's any different. She had no authority in the way that she was able to make an
But
impact.
that's the interesting piece, right? Is that, we accept so many things as that's just the way it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they become convenient outlets for not doing anything, and when your great grandmother, your little booba, decides that great maybe even says, nah, you know what? Divorce. I'm not living with this clown. He's out in the caves. I got to feed the family. Forget
Yeah.
it, right? You can go hang out with the bats. I got to feed my kids, right? Off you go. Right? And I'm going to be an entrepreneur. No, you're not. Well, you want to watch? I'm going to do that, and I'm going to Damascus to do it. It's a bit of a trip, but we'll do it, right? Like, so that I mean, really, if you look at it in the reality of the time, it wasn't a glass ceiling, it was a concrete ceiling,
No, it's true.
right?
Yeah.
And
What
she
you
just
say
went
is very right.
right through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we as leaders often, it's a way for us to create an out, is to give somebody else the authority and the power and say, see, it's not my fault. They
Well,
won't let me.
yeah, and it's so true what you're saying. And I think that it's so relevant to today because there's so many organizations, and you know this as well. Especially, we do a lot of work in the media and tech industries, and there's so many organizations that have reorganized.
Yes.
And there's so many people who are at the effect of. I mean, I know so many organizations where people are just, they've had to go in and fire people the same day. I had a client in one of our groups, we lead executive think tanks called the Executive Inner Circle Group. And one woman was called that day by her boss and said, you have to fire this number of people, no warning. And so she did it. And then she said to me, well, what do I do next? So it's so interesting because I think that so many people can be at the effective because of the way organizations are now moving, because of all the change that's been happening in our universe, no matter what industry you're in. And so I think that so many times you could feel disempowered, but it is a way to actually get your voice back in a very practical, pragmatic way. Where's the one place that I can make a difference in my own universe?
Yeah. Now, actually, talking specifically about that, you are considered a master of company reorganization. So I want to start there. Let's explain to our listeners, to our viewers, what that actually means.
Yeah. Well, it it depends on how you look at it. So
Well, for
so
you, in the
there's
context of what you're doing.
yeah, so I would say so there's lots of differences in how reorganizations work. First of all, there's one where, we've seen in COVID where people will say, hey, our bottom line has dramatically shifted, our business has dramatically shifted. We need to lay people off in order to actually maximize what the bottom line actually is. There can be human resources comes to a leader and tells them that they have to cut people for cost cutting. A reorganization basically means that the way you are currently structured has to change for some fundamental reason. It could be a leader decides that it's time because it's the way that they're currently organized is not a match for the future. A leader leaves and there's fallout, or an organization is bought by another organization, very commonplace, right? Culture, systems, strategies are merging. And so it leads to this, I think you were talking about it in your introduction, it leads to what some people would call change management.
Yes.
And so, yeah, and you're shaking your head. And look, I just have to call bullshit on it because change management is that. It just,
Yep.
it's and so I want to be clear to listeners what I'm talking about. Change management oftentimes is seen as a discipline. It's an art, it's a science, it's the way that people are trained in terms of how to manage the way change actually happens. But you and I both know today, that's actually not the way it works.
Not at all.
So, and also what's so interesting to me, if we're going to put such structure in place, meaning that for change management, we have to look at a few stats that actually make sense. Before COVID, there was data that said that 900 billion with a B is wasted on failed transformations.
Wow.
Now, there's a common statistic that said 3/4 of organizations struggle to execute strategy. Okay, 77% of companies were ill prepared to deal with business disruption. This was pre-COVID.
So 900 billion wasted on.
Failed transformation efforts each year.
Yeah, but again, you see, right there, I get caught in the words, because what the hell is transformation?
Yeah,
Right?
you and I
Because
could
we're in
probably
these nebulous words where bunches of
absolutely,
things can get glued together.
absolutely. I would agree with you. But I would say the way it relates directly to what you and I are talking about is that here's the way it goes. Something is changing. Business is changing. The division is changing. The market is shifting and changing.
Mhm.
Life has changed. Now, because we have digital technologies, it has hyper-connected business. So it turns business into this complex system that's harder to understand and harder to predict outcomes.
Right.
So the rate of change has increased so much that opportunities and threats appear new within 24 hours.
Yeah.
So all of this like 3 to 5 year long-term planning doesn't really work. You know this, because it doesn't have shelf life. And then organizations are siloed. Many are still siloed. So these hierarchical structures, this two-way feedback actually doesn't happen. Every company isn't like Netflix. Some people may know Netflix has this manifesto that internally that where there's two-way feedback always, very transparent, salaries are transparent. Not every organization is like that.
No.
So if that doesn't work, then organizations need to be more flexible. They need to have more adaptive systems in order for when these plates shift, that we can shift dramatically. That's why when in your introduction, we talked about the Ready Zone, we created these like diagnostics to see how you can have an adaptive approach. But if change efforts don't work, one could say that change management doesn't work. That's where your notion comes from, right?
Mhm.
Because it's what we're doing is we're saying that there's just a structure for when this thing happens once in a blue moon. But what if the once in a blue moon happens every single day?
Yeah, the
That's the
blue moon
difference.
is now the moon all the time.
That's right. That's right. And so it doesn't work because it's not adaptive. And it also underestimates the way that people actually, you said it in your introduction, actually can navigate very disruptive systems. And takes this kind of emotional dexterity that we talk a lot about, but I think it's more hotly talked about today because of the velocity of what we're going through. You know, it's
Mhm.
like I grew up in Brooklyn, and I remember in the summer when it was really hot, we used to take the covers off of the fire hydrants, and the water would come flushing out at you. That's what it feels like today for leaders.
Yes.
So it doesn't work. So those adaptive systems don't work. So that's when you talk about what is a reorganization, that's what it is. We're flushing people through a system that doesn't really work. And then people are left to either large scale consulting companies coming in and trying to make sense of it, but it
Yes.
doesn't help you and me on the ground who's doing the work. That's what's so disruptive about it.
So this, I mean, really, this is your point. I mean, you just used an example of Netflix, and you've done work with Netflix and
Mhm.
Warner Media, CNN, Disney, etc. Sony. Um, we've all heard so. I mean, any one of us has heard so much about these reorganizations failing.
Yeah.
So how can it's so adaptive? It's so um, it seems elusive because the process you use today might not work tomorrow because something brand new is coming at you. So how can organizations approach this in a more even thoughtful way, let alone practical, when we get to the practicality too?
Yeah, we have to be practical, otherwise it doesn't make sense. Otherwise, we're just
Right.
talking theory. So what we do is, it's funny because years ago we realized exactly what you're talking about. Like leaders become at the effect of, because what happens is that these changes that you're talking about at a very high level, they're at a board level, they're at a CEO level, and very senior level executives that are the ones maybe implementing strategies are not actually necessarily being empowered to make the decisions to a degree. So what we found is that what we did was when we went in and asked CEOs and asked senior executives, well, how much have you thought about when you start rethinking about where people are going to go and where the business is going? We found that people would say, well, I went to HR and I had a conversation, or I engaged this company and I had the conversation. And I was like, okay, well, and I would say to them, well, tell me your thought process. They're like, well, this is what we need right now. I'm like, okay, that works for today. But if today is tomorrow really quickly, that methodology doesn't work. So what we did was we broke it down into 4 key steps about how to think. And we actually walk people individually through it and teams. And I think it's so vital for every leader. This is what it goes back to, like my Bubba's, like what you were saying, which I love, my great grandmother, is that every leader can do this. And what I love about it too, is if you're visual, you can even do it with Post-its on a napkin, and a way to actually be able to see almost like a storyboard, not to sound very Hollywood, but a way to actually see the unfolding. Right. So we say the number one thing to do is look at present and future, like examine the state of the industry. What's the state of the industry today and a year from now? Because that's probably like even too much, but what's the trends today and a year from now? What are the challenges of the industry a year now and a year from now? What's the state of your organization, same time frame, today and a year from now? Challenges of the organization today and a year from now. What's the state of your team now and a year from now? That's just like an analysis to just think through. The second thing you do is you think about, okay, let's talk about my team. Like, what are our goals now and in the next 12 months? Like, what are they, like blocking and tackling, really practical? What are the reoccurring issues and challenges that I see for them? What are the critical decisions we're going to need to make in the next 6 to 12 months? What feedback do I need from them that I haven't even asked yet? And also, like, okay, let's talk about roles and responsibilities. I find that people don't think about that. Okay, let's talk about what's critical for today, but what's critical for today, but not in the next year. What's critical, what's not critical for today, but will be in the next year. Do you know how many people are like foaming at the mouth because they didn't think of digital roles, which is now everything? And so then you can start thinking about, okay, once you got that, now you could start thinking about stakeholders and customers. How will that change? How is that going to morph? How is that going to evolve today and in a year? Why is that important? Really simple. Then the absolute last piece you think of is, what resources do we need? Facilities, equipment, systems. Then you think of the positions you need to add. Then you analyze who you have. And then the last bit that is absolutely 100% almost always forgotten is you have to revitalize or revise, I would say, your role. Because once you take all these steps that we're talking about, the one person who's left standing that you haven't thought about is yourself.
Absolutely.
Because you're going to change everything, but you're not changing yourself. It's like the craziest thing I've ever seen. So once you actually unpack those steps, you have what's so great about doing this that we've seen is that as a leader, you get so many ideas that you hadn't thought about how the business is growing. You're able to see the value of your team in a whole other way. You're able to see the nuances of the market. And then you're able to go thoughtfully into strategy. And I got to tell you, I find that business improves, you get more ideas, and you have a clear thought plan that you can present to the board, to senior leadership, to HR. It becomes like Moses parted the Red Sea, not to use a biblical analogy.
But it's interesting because I love what you're saying here, and it's important. And at the same time, where things sort of, I don't know, so let's just talk about this change management lie in the context of what you've just been saying.
Yeah, please.
Right? So, the part of the change management lie is that somehow you're going to do something to make change easy.
Yeah, not true.
So human beings don't like change. And human beings love change. And people go, well, isn't that a contradiction? Yes, human beings are extremely contradictory. So we want stability and we want variety. We want those two things.
It's true.
The measure of those two things will change. entirely subjectively. So
Absolutely.
Charlie over here likes a lot of risk, and he's an 80-20. He's an 80 risk, and he's a 20 stability.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Bob over here is exactly the reverse. He wants an 80 stability with a 20% change. So the 20% change for him shows up in, yeah, we'll go see a different kind of movie. But we're not leaving the job. Right?
Right.
So understanding that, this is why I think it's so vital for people, for leaders, to understand that there isn't an overall structure to saying, okay, well, here's what we'll do. And this is part of the illusion of change management. It's so subjective because, and here's the piece, you as the leader think that you get it, so they will. And that's not true. And so, first of all, I believe this with every fiber of my being. Leaders must lead. What does that mean? It means leaders go first. What does that mean? It means you've got to have the emotional courage to step into something that's difficult, owning that it's difficult. So owning it overtly to everybody, this is challenging, it's difficult for me, but I'm going to do it because I believe in where this is going. And I know that for you, you believe that emotional courage is vital in leaders today. Talk to us about, is that in alignment with what I was just saying, or is it something more or less or different than that?
Yeah, so let's get really more granular.
Sure.
Because what you're talking about is advanced.
Yes.
For someone to get to a place where they can go, I'm behind it, makes sense, let's go. So let's be clear. I want to unpack two things. One is that the formula that we talked about reorganizing, right? That way I was thinking about, very thoughtful. That's one piece, right? It doesn't take away the emotions from it.
No.
And what we underestimate, and I thought it was brilliant, McKinsey just came out with a study. I thought this was so fascinating. They came out with a report that talked about the future of work post-COVID. Mm-hmm. So what they cited specifically is that workers need to learn more, you'll love this, social and emotional skills in order to move into occupations with higher wage brackets. And they said that the demand for those skills are going to be more critical in places like the United States or Britain or China, India, Germany, Japan. Okay. Now, when you have companies like Google, Hilton, IBM that are now more focused on skills rather than degrees, this becomes more significant. So what I'm saying is, when we talk about like emotional courage or the emotion side of it, the reason why it's so talked about is when you'll love it. When COVID hit, you know this, everyone started caring about what people thought. Everyone cared about what people felt. They took time. How are you feeling? Right? All that mushy gushy that people thought, but it wasn't sustainable, right? Because people felt like we didn't dive into the work. We're not addressing the work, right? Okay. But the thing is, unless you help people process through what they're feeling, and that means being emotionally granular. So take this as an example. And a woman named Dr. Susan David has amazing work on this. Let's say I'm a new leader and I say, or let's say I'm a leader and I say, I'm angry and my team is angry. Well, isn't that very different than going into a meeting and saying, I'm actually really fearful about all the industry changes and the impact on my team. And my team saying, hey, we're really overwhelmed by the level of work. We don't have systems to put into place in order to make it happen. And we're afraid we're never going to meet our quotas. And we're afraid that we're really going to fail. Very different conversation. Mm-hmm. So that level of emotional granularity, unless we can help people get there, we're already not even in the mark. You can set up these frames and structures, but unless you have the responsibility as a leader to shepherd them through, to be able to take a moment, I can't tell you how many times over the last year, I've heard people say, I feel like I'm having a therapy session, because we're not taught with all of the emotional intelligence education out there. We still don't get the fact that if we ask people how they're feeling and we actually help them process through it, the end result will be that people will move through change faster. It's simple as anything, but it's much more complex to do. So, that's and the impact is amazing, because if you think of what also has emerged in COVID is this phrase of toxic positivity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a program we lead for marketing and creative leaders in the media business, and we were having a group discussion, and one of the executives was saying that he was afraid of sharing how he really felt, because everyone on their virtual meetings would simply want everyone to be happy, and starting and saying anything that was outside the norm or that defined their version of happiness squashed his voice and his creativity. One of the most creative executives and leaders now does not have a voice. Can you imagine the damage that does to an organization and a team? Now that's measurable.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm talking about. That's so vital.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying there is again so important. But you and I talked about this last time we spoke. That my experience is, and you and I work with these leaders. My experience is that the leaders themselves are emotionally inept
Yes, I would agree.
at dealing it with themselves, let alone dealing it with their people. So they want to hand it off to somebody. Well, who are they going to hand it off to? HR? HR doesn't exist anymore. HR is a buffer zone for legal. That's all it is. It's got nothing to do with people. It's just a buffer zone to make sure that John doesn't get fired because he said something that might be inappropriate. I mean, so it's not that. So they don't feel like they have that. And this is where I'm really seeing the gap, Esther. And I really want to hear from you is the gap there is, yes, I'm hearing the same thing. You and I talked about this, that when the beginning of the pandemic, I said to all of my leaders, you need me more now than ever, because you're going to have to deal with the humanity more than anything. You have to deal with the emotions, the humanity. And my clients are highly emotionally developed. That's my specialty in bringing them forward in that. And even they're hitting the wall. So the average schmagegi who's not got any idea, has never had any kind of training, because we both know that people are in 10 to 15 years in leadership roles before they get any leadership training, let alone emotionally developed.
It's true.
And so they're trying to lead people through this. You're talking about getting emotionally granular. They're going, my wife asked me how I'm feeling. I say, tired, hungry, or horny. Those are the only feelings I have. Right. So, you know what I mean? That's how a lot of people are looking at. So I want to address that, because you're doing this on with big organizations.
Oh, yeah.
How do you confront that when the executives or the team is saying, listen, we got this, we understand, and you're talking about getting emotionally granular, but we don't know what granular is. We don't even, we've got, like I said, we've got 3 feelings: hungry, horny, and tired. That's it.
It's interesting, because what we do is we start with something very small that's very big. So meaning that everyone knows, and I'll give you an example. Everyone knows what it is to be triggered, activated. It's a normal human thing.
Yep.
I remember someone once said, if I come to work and just deal with work, I come in at 9 and leave at 11. But because I deal with people, I come in at 9 a.m. and I leave at 10 o'clock at night. So, I mean, it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you get where I'm going.
I do.
So I'll give you an example. I had a client who was the chief, at the head of business affairs for a big entertainment company. She says to me, and we've been working on the fact, exactly what you're talking about. So we've been working on the fact that she has sharp elbows, is not very great in terms of how she's building relationships, and lots of people don't even want to work with her, which is, could be commonplace when you have a very tough personality.
Sure.
So she gets an email from her boss, who's the COO, who says to her, can you tell me she sent an email out and said, we just closed this major deal. I'm really excited about it. So he sends her a 1 to 2 line email and says, can you share with me the deal points? And she went bananas. So we're talking, and she says to me, what does he think? Does he think that I'm not equipped? Does he think that that I don't know what I'm doing? I have 20 years of legal experience. Does he think, and on and on and on. So I said to her, and this is where a tool comes in. We call it the reality check, which is an affectionate tool, but I think it's a wisely said one. I said to her, look, you're a lawyer. If I put you on a stand in a court of law, tell me what the facts are. Just look at the facts. And she said, okay, he sent me an email. I said, okay. And what did it say? She said, he asked me what the deal points were. I said, okay, great. What did you make it mean? So then we started, and I wanted her to physically see it. So she said, I made it mean that he doesn't trust me. He doesn't think I'm a good attorney. That our 20-year relationship will now be compromised. He made it mean also that I don't know how to lead my team. He made it mean also that I don't know how to negotiate properly. He made it, and on and on and on. And I had, like a full page, because as humans, as you know, we never create a comedy. We always create a drama. So I said to her, okay, well, what's the impact of you seeing it that way? So we're looking at facts, interpretations, and now impact. And she said, well, if I continue to see it that way, then our relationship will never be strong. In fact, I don't actually even know how I'm going to negotiate another deal, because I'll feel like this doubt is always hanging over me, and I'll wind up leaving the company. So I said to her, and she said, and every time we interact, there will be a consistent mistrust. So I said to her, well, let's think about your intention of your relationship with him. What's the intention of your relationship with him? And she said, well, my intention is we've been known each other for 20 years or more, and we've had such high respect for each other. I want to make sure that I can always learn from him, and we can both grow in our relationship together. So I said, okay, well, given what you just said, now how are you going to answer the email? And she just started laughing. And she said, I'm just going to tell him the deal points. And she did. And you know what the email was back from him? That's great. That was it. So that's something, because when you talk about leaders, I think that sometimes we think that this is this Herculean thing we have to learn to do. But if we just break it down to what are the facts, what are my interpretations, what is the impact of if I continue to see it that way, and how does that align with my intention? We find that people actually can then see differently. And that's all that it really is. It's a different kind of seeing, and it doesn't take this whole big effort in order to be able to do it differently.
I think you made a great point there, because in our work, we talk about the importance of, to steal a Kellyanne Conway term, facts from alternative facts. We actually say that to people. Can you separate the fact from the alternative facts? And they go, of course they know I'm making fun. And I say, well, what do you mean? And I say, well, there's the facts that are verifiable. And then they are the alternative facts, which is the subjective meaning you've given something. And when you give something subjective meaning, it feels very real, and it feels like it's a fact. So John hates me. How do you know? Well, he's never spoken to me and never asked me for input. Okay. Maybe John hates redheads and you've got red hair. Maybe he doesn't hate you. He just hates redheads. Maybe he was bullied by a redhead at school. Maybe he is very shy and doesn't like talking to women. Maybe he, there's a million maybes.
Oh yeah,
I would agree. All alternate facts that are going on in somebody else's head. And my line is, if you think you know what someone else is thinking, that's not a relationship. That's psychic. And unless you're coming to me with a crystal ball, let's move on.
It's true.
Right. So let's dump the crystal ball. And if there's a real question, go and have a conversation. And if you're really courageous, you can say, And this is the start line. And I say, if you're courageous, you can say this. Here's the shit I'm making up.
Oh, I would absolutely agree with you.
Right? Here's the shit I'm making up. So here's the shit I'm making up, Bob. You've never once consulted me. So here's the shit I'm making up. That you hate me. You hate me because I'm a woman. You hate me because I'm a man. You hate me because I've got red hair. You hate me because I'm over 6 feet. I'm under 5 feet. Whatever it is. You just made up some shit. And what every time, and it's, I could tell you, and I hope that you're listening to this as you're listening, tuning into the show. Every time I've had an executive do that, a leader do that, every single time they burst out laughing at themselves.
Oh
They
yeah,
go,
because they see
they
how
go,
ridiculous
I
they
was
found how
so
ridiculous they
embarrassed
are.
to say it.
Yeah.
And then I said it and I got halfway through it and I just cracked up and I realized it was entirely my stuff. It was entirely my stuff. And we usually create a greater bond over it because it's not real.
But
And
you know
it's the
what?
separating effects.
But you know what you're talking about too? I want to circle back to something you said earlier when we were talking about change management. This is why change management doesn't work. Because the thing is that every leader leads differently. There's not an overarching standard. So that means that when you go forward and try to do these very scientific endeavors, they're actually very unsuccessful. That's why when COVID started, I kept talking about this notion about a portable culture, because it was really interesting because it was so fascinating to see what cultures are portable and which ones are not. Absolutely fell on its face. And what you're talking about is how leaders can actually create almost like mini portability in their own cultures for what they can control. And that anyone can do in their world.
So talk to us for a moment, because I don't want to go into anything that appears to be jargon.
Yes.
What do you mean by a portable culture?
Yeah, let's unpack it. So what I mean by that in its purest way is that it's a culture that has resilience, it has staying power, it could be pliable in the face of dynamic change. It's movable, it's shiftable, it's unbreakable. I'll give you a couple examples because the leaders whose job it is to ensure that the culture is the way it's supposed to be, that means that it's elastic, are actually impatient with it not being that way. So meaning that I'm impatient that it's not adhering, let's say, to the vision or values or principles by which the organization is actually built. And I'll actually move someone up, and I'll move someone either up or I'll move them out because they actually don't do it. Now that's very courageous. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. So, and I mentioned a little bit before, but there's a great company called Humu. I don't know if you've heard of it, Laszlo Bock's company. And what was interesting was during COVID, what they decided to give their teams every other Friday off. Because he said that it felt right and they needed and people needed extra care. Now, what's interesting is there's great data on this because employers who really took time to make a difference in the lives of employees, it amounts to 23% and 17% in workers who report better physical and mental health. Now, what's fascinating was companies who actually have implemented this 4-day work week. Most have seen an increase in productivity, like Microsoft did an experiment in Japan with a 4-day work week, and they boosted productivity by 40%. People were happier, and they didn't need paid leave. So you have that. I would call that a portable culture. That's a culture that says, hey, you know what? No matter if you're here, if you're not, here's how we're adhering to make sure that you are happy and that you're successful in your role. Because we know that the strategy is going to last whether or not you're in the physical 4 walls or you're out. So that's different, as an example, of a woman that I mentioned before in our executive think tank who said to me, after she laid the people off that I mentioned before, she calls her boss and says, hey, look, I want to talk about, here's how I'm seeing how things are going to work now that we have a reduced workforce. And her boss says to her, and she admits to her boss that she's totally burnt out. and wants to talk about, and wants to figure out how to really make, and the staff is burnt out. And so,
Yep.
and we know that 71% of people have experienced burnout in 2020. So she starts to really methodically, like, hey, everything you and I would say is fabulous leadership, right? Here's my analysis of what's happened, the fallout. I'm moving really quickly, but people are really burnt out, including myself. So her boss says to her, you just have to work harder. You just have to step up. She says to her, I am working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. I have nothing more to give. I have nothing more to give. So that's what I mean by a portable culture. If you say, this is when lip service doesn't work. You say that we're going to adhere to certain things, but then the moment it's acid tested, like in the case of Humu, they rise to the occasion. But in the case of the other company, they don't. So it's a great example of the dichotomy of what we're talking about.
Yep. And oftentimes it's nothing more than that. It's stuff that's thrown around.
That's right. That's right. And I'm with you. I think these big words like communication and leadership and things like that, we need to actually really define for people, especially during these times when change is so vast, because they become, not only do they become meaningless, but they mean different things during these times too.
Yes. And I think that, of course, we all understand that trust is important, but part of what happens psychologically for human beings is part of trust. It comes from certainty.
Yes.
And so we don't have certainty economically, health, the situation in the world, in a COVID or maybe even potentially post-COVID world. So all those things are sort of balls in the air. That takes away a sense of safety within the individual, lack of trust. So let's just, in the last part of the show here, let's just sort of focus in on that. How can a leader listening, watching us, sort of harness that power of that uncertainty and potentially make themselves, the organization, into a high trust organization?
It's so funny because, it's during times of uncertainty, everybody just wants ground underneath their feet. And what I find is that this is the perfect time to simply make it up. So for example, well, it's true how it sounds. So I'll give you an example. So there's a leader, he's senior vice president, marketing inside of a media company. And he says to me, our organization is going, and he works for a big name brand. He said, we're going through so much change, but here's what I haven't heard. We've just laid off a bunch of people. I haven't heard a new vision from our CEO, nor she keeps saying she's going to communicate it. It's been months. And I have a new boss, 1 year old. I don't think that's new anymore. I have a boss that's new. She hasn't communicated anything. So I'm waiting here, trying to figure out, and my team is new. So I'm trying to figure out how I orient them and what I can do. I said, it's really simple. You just have to make it up. So meaning that I said to him, you have a thought of where this brand creative team is going. Let's articulate it as a narrative, a story, 2 to 3 paragraphs. Where we're really going, that's aspirational, it's exciting for people. And we also recently did it with a global tech company. And they were really in the weeds. They spent like 4 months doing it because they were they really were stuck on it. But what emerged is amazing. So what emerged is a picture of the desired future, but that's not where it stops. I said to him, now we need to be committed to it as a team. How is the team going to actually be committed? We call that a team commitment. Like, what are we committing to in order to deliver on that? And we're making a contract with each other, how we're committing to it. I don't like to use the words like vision because sometimes people don't even use that crap. But if what are we committed to together, then we can actually hold each other accountable for that. And that we can control in our tiny little world. And then what we can do too is we can create what we call an impact guide. Like, How are we going to make decisions together? How are we going to communicate? What's going to happen when things go off the rails? How are we going to give each other feedback? And so if you just did that, that would change the fabric of every team. 97% of the teams that we work with have nothing like that in place. I mean, they do now, but when we started with them, have no idea if that's in place. So if you even explore questions together, so let's say you do that. Let's say coming out of COVID or coming out of some severe disruption, or even when you're in it, you could say, what has uncertainty taught us and how we achieve our priorities? How has uncertainty reshaped our priorities? What has become our priority as a result of the uncertainty? How can we become more anticipatory? Or if we're going to adopt uncertainty as one of our highest values, as an access to high productivity, and I think, and you know this all well, the old, what do we need? Stop, start, and continue doing. Because I think that what we do is if we rail against it, then we don't actually acknowledge that it's happening all the time. So if you do that, I'm telling you, you will create certainty for people in your tiny little world. And that's frankly all that we can absolutely control during times of change, period.
Yeah, again, but it is that commitment to having those conversations, to connecting with people, and to understand that nothing is permanent. I mean, we all know that as a term, but we don't like to face it. It's just like, oh yeah, nothing's permanent. Yeah, and then it goes away and you're weeping. Well, I get that. I understand that's part of the human condition. I do it too. But you did know it was coming. Change is coming.
Yeah, but here's the thing that's different though about it. If I sit down with you and I say to you, like, how are we going to deal with all this change that's happening? You're like, huh? You're deer in headlights. But if I say to you, let's think of a time in your career, in your life, when there was such mass uncertainty that you felt like the ground was pulled out from you and you were able to rally and made a difference. What was the story? How did it happen? How did that unfold? Who is in it? Tell me the story. And then you're able to take from there you just literally can write down what the lessons are. And then all you need to say is, how can we apply it to this?
Yep.
Because that's a way where people go, it's not like it sucks and it's terrible, because that's typically what happens during what you and I are talking about. Look, no one asked for COVID, and it's not like people are doing a hallelujah dance because COVID came around.
No.
But it did give us the opportunity to say those kinds of things and to ask ourselves those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as we're coming towards the end of the show, I wanted to ask you, because you've done some phenomenal work, as I said, with these huge brands, and your organization does great work. But I think that one of the great failings of people is that we look at ends, we look at beginnings, we look at ends, we don't look at middles.
Okay.
Invariably we're on a path, and the line from A to Z is not or A to Z is not a direct line.
Yeah.
And so the line goes a bit wiggly and squiggly along the way. What was the turning point for you? Because you probably were part of the change management culture, and you probably followed or saw the things going along. What was the turning point in your life, in your leadership, in your business philosophy that started making you go, I got to do different?
Oh God, there was two. I don't know if we have time to talk about both, but there were two. One, I was an executive at Disney, and we were sitting in a senior management team meeting, and there was a management consultant in the room, and it was a time of a lot of high tech, of a tech boom. And I remember the CFO says, he starts citing numbers of people who've left. And I said, wait a second, it seems like that sounds like a lot. Can you tell me what the percentage is? And he says, a third of our workforce have left. And I said, you seem very calm. Like, what do you mean a third of our workforce is left? He goes, yeah, but we're Disney, it's not a problem. And the management consultant, which I was shocked, says, yeah, she just agreed. And I remember I sat there and the head of sales of me, and both of us were floored. And I remember I left and I thought, I don't know if this is right anymore. Like, this is just, how can I be someplace where there's such a disbelief in the impact of that kind of loss, and we're not looking at it from a business perspective, from a human perspective, like, wait a minute. And even when we started to unpack it, we started to ask questions, there was not a desire to engage. So that, I would tell you, is one turning point. The second was, if we have time for it, when I relocated to Uganda, Africa, I relocated to Uganda, Africa a few years ago because I thought that what I would do is my heart was started to be into international development work. So I ran my business in the United States, the business we're talking about, in the evening because of the time zone differences.
Yeah, of course.
And then during the day, so I think I got like 2 hours or 3 hours of sleep a night. But it was interesting because I went to Uganda because I think this is the seed of change. Like, let's go to do international development work, and that'll be the seed of change. Not that people are not doing that amazing work. But then in Uganda, I realized, wait a minute, I had this epiphany that I couldn't believe took me so long to get. Business and industry transform countries and cultures and people. That's where the opportunity is. That's where the power is. And so I literally realized it on a balcony when I was typing up this assessment for this AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis organization. And so then I moved. I had picked up to move to Uganda, like I was never coming back. And then I just said, that's it, I'm coming back home. That was the end of it. So those are two big things that really changed my business and my life in a massive way. So
when you think about particularly that last one, the Uganda one, what is the, if you were, somebody said to you, what's the message there that you would like to translate to others about that?
You know, I realized something very, very simple is that on an organic level, people want basically the same things. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be valued. They want to have, look, when I was working in organizations in Uganda, they want to have trust, they want to have respect, they want to have safety. The cost of it is much higher in a different way. The impact is different. And so I would say that, and the other thing that I would say to people is, it's who you're being that makes the greatest difference. And it was interesting because Ugandans have a very different way of being with each other and the value for relationships and family that was so precious. And so that doesn't change no matter what part of the world you're in. And that was a huge lesson for me.
Yeah, I can honestly say that, you know, I've traveled a lot. I lived in a lot of different countries and did all those kinds of things. And I can honestly say I'm very grateful for that, because the cultural insights I understood that helped me to broaden myself and breach many of my own biases. But when you get past the upper layer, and start to dig it underneath, it's pretty much the same. You know, I have many Italian friends who, you know, who have Jewish mothers. They're not Jewish mothers. They're Catholic Italian mothers, but they're Jewish mothers. I have Chinese friends who have Jewish mothers. They're not Jewish.
That's true.
It's like, it's the same thing. And it's this, you know, it's this, we forget that we look at the external difference and we forget the internal same. And if you get to that, you start to find the values of human beings and what really matters to them and why it matters to them. And once we confront that, we can so easily find ways to bond with other human beings.
It's so true. You know, it's so interesting. There was a flip side of that you made me think of. I remember I was doing this analysis of this organization that I mentioned to you. It was a good U.S. government project. I was analyzing the impact of the distribution of AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis drugs in northern Uganda. And I was sitting with the head of one of the largest districts in all of Uganda. And I said to him, how do you measure which districts get the drugs? How do you know? Because there's so many aid organizations. There's 500 aid organizations in northern Uganda. How do you measure who gets the drugs? He goes, I don't care. And I said, well, what do you mean you don't care? He goes, I don't care. And I don't care because they're going to get them. I said, but is that accurate? Because some could be over-indexed and some under. And he said, I still don't care. So it's so interesting because the value of human life, it goes back to human dignity. The value of human life, how we see it, how we treat it, is also in some respects no different where you are no matter where you are. And so there were people in his office who cared much more about it. Then I got, a 400-page report. but I was like, I don't need a report. I need one page to tell me. But it's so interesting about how we have human dignity for each other and how we actually hold that. And it goes back exactly to what you're saying about trust, respect, and safety. Can you imagine? So you just reminded me of that story. It was a moment in time.
It never ceases to amaze me.
Yes.
Because I see people because of psychological background, but I see people as deeply psychological, and I look at that psychology of what it is, and I think how much has to happen for you to go, I don't care. How much do you have to become compartmentalized in order to go, I don't care?
It's so true.
Because that's not your nature. That's not human nature. Human nature is to care very much. Esther, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I really want to make sure that people know where they can find out about you and all of your wonderful resources. Would you please tell our listeners, our viewers, where they can find out about you?
It's very simple. It's thereadyzone.com. That's it. You can go there and find all the resources that you're talking about. My book, resources for you. It's all there.
And you're also on social media.
Yes.
We'll make sure that we post the links to social media, to your own website, thereadyzone.com. I will point to where you can find Esther on the social medias as well. And it's been a pleasure and honor. I really want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It's been great. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. And for you, dear listener, remember that you can hang out with other conscious leaders and you can chat about this episode that you've been listening to or any past episodes by simply going to our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty Leadership and Loyalty podcast. It doesn't matter how successful you are. If your employees and your customers don't understand what gives your company meaning, you're only working at a fraction of your capability. To find out how you can hire me, Dov Baron, as a speaker or leadership strategist for yourself or your organization, go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. Because unified meaning is the one single monolithic difference between mediocrity and greatness for individuals and for companies. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Until next time, stay curious, my friends. Stay curious about the lies you've been telling yourself about change management and what it really means to deeply connect with your people to build the levels of trust and safety you need so that change is constantly fluid. I'm Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you in tapping into your dragonfire to reach that next level of clarity, focus, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.